Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Melissa Sorensen, PBSA's first dedicated executive director, and Michelle LeBlanc, Executive Vice President, Compliance and Privacy with PlusOne Solutions. Melissa Sorensen brings to PBSA a wealth of industry acumen along with legal training, which combined with her experience as its board member, positions Melissa as the ideal candidate to represent PBSA as an executive director. Prior to this role, Melissa worked in the industry for 7.5 years, during when she served as the Compliance and Contracts Officer for Verifications Incorporated. With over 25 years' experience in the background screening industry, Michelle LeBlanc brings solid strengths and understanding in technology, legislation, and operations, as well as the sales and financial aspects of managing a business in this industry. We are proud to welcome Melissa and Michelle to present on the topic, Background Screening in a COVID World, an industry update.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to be with you for the next 30 minutes talking about background checks in light of the current global pandemic. As you've noticed, my name is Melissa Sorensen, and I'm currently the Executive Director for the Professional Background Screening Association, PBSA. I've been in this role for a little over 7 years, and prior to that, spent also a little over 7 years working directly in the background screening industry in a compliance and legal role. With me today is PBSA's chair, Michelle LeBlanc. Michelle?
Thanks, Melissa. I've been active with PBSA now for almost 10 years. Been in the screening industry in both Canada and the US for about 25. I'm currently the chair of PBSA, and I'm happy to bring both the business and the PBSA perspectives to this presentation. As they said in the introduction, if you have questions at any point during the presentation, you can submit them through the Q&A tab on the main screen, which is right beside the session window, and we'll be sure to save some time at the end to answer those questions. I'll now turn it back to Melissa to get us started.
Thanks, Michelle. As we mentioned, we are thrilled to be invited to participate in this virtual conference, Neeyamo's 2020 Rise Above. Let's start with a little bit about PBSA. The Professional Background Screening Association is the only industry association dedicated to the employment and tenant screening space for the past 17 years. Our mission is simple: to advance excellence in the screening profession. And our vision, to be the trusted global authority for the screening profession, aligns with our mission and all of the activities we do. PBSA has over 800 member companies with thousands of individuals within those companies from all around the globe who are the heart of our association. Regardless of your location, there's a PBSA member nearby and ready to work with you. We're going to use our time today to talk about the impact of coronavirus on the background screening industry. But before we dig into that, I'd like to spend just a few minutes setting the stage for what a background check is, how the process works, and how your colleagues around the globe are using background checks in their organizations. We'll be sharing some of the data that we've gathered over the past several years in an industry survey with HR professionals. I do want to note that we're going to breeze through some of these initial slides in order to get to the latter content in our session. We've included them here so that those of you who'd like to download the PowerPoint during or after the conference have this information available to you at your fingertips. Okay, let's start with just a little bit of background screening 101 to ensure we're all on the same page. Depending on where you are in the world, there are different terms used to describe a background check. Screening, investigation, and in the USA, they're frequently referred to as their legal definition or name, which is consumer reports. The availability and type of searches that make up a background check, as well as the process and what's legally permissible, can vary by country or even jurisdictions within the country. This is where working with our members can be a valuable undertaking. The majority of background checks include a search of criminal record information. There are several different types of criminal record checks that are compiled into a thorough background screening review. Depending on where we are in the world, some countries rely more on criminality checks than others. In fact, there are areas where criminal background checks or criminal checks in general aren't available to third parties at all, whether employers or background screening organizations. Criminal checks, however, aren't the only components that are included in or can be included in a background checks. There are other types, often referred to as verifications, that can be used and relied on by employers as well. Verifications might be things like education verifications, verifying someone's degree that they've earned, verifying their employment history, or even personal and professional reference checks. Other components of a background check might be risk-focused. Our members can deliver services like driving history, sex offender registry information, various watch lists, or adverse media information. No matter which search types are delivered by our members at the request of their customers, PBSA has access to a wealth of individuals with expertise in the industry and around the globe to help employers meet their hiring needs. Regardless of the components, the high-level process remains fairly similar around the globe. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of how the relationship starts and all the various contractual and legal requirements that may apply. If you have questions about that, please reach out to me or to Michelle after the conference, and one of us would be happy to set up a call with you. Generally, a background check starts with the individual consenting or allowing the prospective employer or landlord to conduct the background check. This is a key differentiation between using a professional background screening association, like one of our members, and versus an investigator or other due diligence or covert process that often is not as transparent and likely does not include the consent of the individual to be screened. Once the individual has authorized the background check, the background screening organization gets to work pulling together information on the individual based on the scope or the components the employer has selected. Most employers that I have worked with over the years are curious about what their colleagues in other organizations are doing as part of their screening program. To that end, PBSA has been conducting an annual survey of human resources professionals. We've been doing this survey for 4 years now to gather some of this data. In those 4 years, we've seen some things remain the same. The vast majority of employers do background checks or some kind or another, and their primary reason for doing background checks also remain constant. Number one, HR professionals report conducting background checks to protect employees and customers, i.e. safety. 2, they also report conducting background checks to improve the quality of hires. And 3, because they are required by law or regulation. Now that we have 4 years of data, we're starting to see some trends surface. First, employers are screening more individuals. I suspect this rise might be related to the gig economy. Employers aren't as likely to limit background checks today to just their direct employees. We're seeing a rise in background checks for contract labor, such as those in the gig economy, volunteers, and other vendor representatives. Employers recognize that regardless of whether the individual is a direct employee or contract representative, gig service provider, they're often the individuals who represent their brand. So a background check for all of these individuals is becoming more and more common and important. Employers are also screening more frequently, no longer just at the initial time of hire. These next 2 slides show us a little bit about the components that are going into a background check. Here you can see that when we asked about what components employers use when screening all of their candidates, we're seeing an increase in areas like education verifications, employment verifications, social media, sex offender registries, and professional license verifications. All of these are going up, trending up a little bit year over year. On the flip side, when asked what components employers never use, we see those numbers going down across the board in many of these same categories. things like, again, education, employment, social media, and the like were often not common in 2017 and 18 and are now starting to be used more frequently. And importantly, employers around the globe recognize the importance and need for background checks regardless of where they or their prospective employees are located. This year, 85% of our survey respondents told us that they think access to international screening is important, with more than half, 57%, saying international screening is important to their organization in particular. And around a quarter of employers report conducting background checks at their locations around the globe, as well as on individuals around the globe. What may be particularly interesting in measuring some of this data in 2021, because of course this survey was completed in the first quarter of 2020, i.e. before coronavirus. So this lays the groundwork for what a background check is or was during normal times. And then there was COVID. Michelle, let's use the rest of our time here today to talk about what's changed in our industry as a result of the pandemic, what we saw, how our members responded, and the actions that we took as an association.
Sounds great. Well, without question, 2020 has been a tough year for most as a result of COVID. We'll begin with a summary of how employers, organizations were impacted. We'll talk a little bit about how PBSA and some of our members responded, and then wrap it up with questions. As COVID hit, many organizations instituted hiring freezes. Some actually had hiring sprees, depending on their industry. Many of the main contacts that our members work with are in HR departments, and they've been faced with the challenge of balancing all of their regular HR tasks related to their current workload, as well as mediation for COVID effects. This included having to focus on moving staff into remote work arrangements, including all the equipment and policy support that might require. Layoffs or perhaps furloughs were part of their organization's actions. Sometimes they had to identify more creative ways of remote recruitment techniques so that they could continue to hire and fill these positions. Continuing to provide employee support through various assistance plans, very important during this time. There may have been additional administration because of payroll changes or possibly programs to support payroll through COVID. Depending on the industry and the seniority of hire, some vacancies were actually very difficult to fill because maybe personal health situations were keeping people from coming back or continuing to work, or they may have preferred to stay at home for various reasons. Rest assured that we also saw most of this firsthand, and we know it has not been easy. For organizations who were able to continue background screening through COVID, you may have noticed some screening was taking longer or maybe could not be done at all. Depending on the type of check and jurisdiction, courts were restricting access, and some had delays in processing because of lockdowns or even limited staffing. As members, we saw many of those same things in our organizations, and we were forced to respond to them. What we saw and heard from many of our members was very similar to what we see and hear from HR departments and customers every day. The work product and the processes had to change. Depending on the location and the customer composition, some of our members experienced everything from a minimal reduction in volume, so maybe 15%, to much more dramatic drops in their business. Each member then had to respond in their own way, whether they were scaling back staffing, changing their service complement, or offering other incentives and products to secure their short and long-term viability. As many criminal records come from government sources, some were automated and remained very consistent. There were all manner of delays and even closures during the last 6 or more months for those records that weren't available electronically. Some of these issues have been resolved now, but staffing shortages, random closures, and other delays still continue in some areas. In the US specifically, various weather, personal, and political events were also causing more localized closures. So that meant even in regions that didn't necessarily have COVID restrictions, there may have been other factors impacting access to records. So for example, California and a lot of the West Coast of the US had wildfires and other causes to impact the court access. We'll speak a little bit later in this presentation about what we did as an association to address this. But while we throw it all under the banner of the COVID impact, there were a lot of other things happening right around the world that were impacting the access to records. Employers and schools maybe were also going into lockdown or remote work situations, and some of those records, if they were not automated, were also becoming a little bit more challenging to obtain. This was increasing turnaround times, or in some cases, records were simply not able to be completed. Add to this that our members were also trying to manage their own operations for sustainability, adopting more remote work arrangements, canceling travel, and worrying about their staff and making sure that their office was safe and healthy through COVID. Some members had customers whose volume exploded, so for them, the challenge was to keep up with that. No matter what situation our members were in, it's been a very interesting year, and they've looked at various revenue models and methods to best support their customers. Some have also created new rehire or rescreening packages, trying to kind of bring people back to the office, making sure that they're screened effectively, exploring remote drug testing options. Some have even gone into offering PPE or other COVID-related services. And innovation and creativity has been plentiful during this time. As the English proverb goes, necessity is the mother of invention, which means the driving force for inventions and innovation during this time has been need. As though this wasn't enough, the US also spent much of the year focused on the presidential election, which we know took place just last week. So as a trade association, it's our job to stay in front of our member needs. So that has been an equally challenging event this year. Like you, all of our members as an association have had to alter course and preserve resources for long-term sustainability while making sure that we are providing valuable, time-sensitive information and support for our members. Internally, we moved swiftly and decisively, renegotiating many partner contracts and focusing on the most important business at hand. The financial viability of the association was imperative. In-person accreditation audits were suspended. For safety concerns, our US mid-year and annual conferences were canceled, the latter then replaced by a virtual forum. The APAC annual general meeting was also moved from their standard November timeframe to September to coincide with the virtual conference that we held in the US. And unfortunately, the continued impact of COVID and rising case numbers in the US and globally has just presented us the decision to cancel our spring 2021 conference as well. Details will be forthcoming on a virtual format, but we've now had 3 in-person member experiences that have had to be delayed or significantly altered. Thankfully, while those tough changes were occurring, our councils, board, and committees within PBSA, all comprised of volunteers, continued to do great work. Whether it was the BSCC, the Background Screening Credentialing Council, who oversees our accreditation program, or government relations committees in Canada or the US who track and respond to proposed legislation changes, our volunteers have remained engaged, busy, and delivering for our members during this time. Some examples of accomplishments during this busy time were quite easy to identify. In the US, PBSA Government Relations Committee members and our partners continued to ensure access to records wherever we could. This was especially challenging in the US with so many jurisdictions and court record processes to monitor, but with a determined effort and strong communications, we kept members abreast of changes and closures, and then in many cases, the eventual reopenings. Our government relations leadership team has done a tremendous job engaging with regulators and lawmakers to ensure awareness of the impact of COVID and closures on our screening industry. We've been sharing your concerns as customers and employers, as well as our own, as we saw processes and products be impacted. We went to work on behalf of employers and background screeners alike to ensure governmental bodies knew that background checks are critical to the business and they were being impacted. Specifically in the European region, they began holding weekly meetings with Disclosure Scotland and also met regularly with the Disclosure and Barring Service. In the US, we met with the Federal Trade Commission and worked to get court runners deemed essential workers, or collaborated with courts to improve or gain access to online records. On top of everything that needed to be done in response to COVID, we also had many regular activities moving ahead as an association. In Canada, that included getting improved and alternate EID verification options approved for our members. We've also in Canada responded to 2 provincial privacy consultations that came up in Quebec and Ontario. The privacy regimes are currently being reviewed, so we had the opportunity to provide feedback there. We continued to work with regulators, as I mentioned, in the US, that's generally been the FTC, the RCMP in Canada. The Criminal Record Trade Body has been the focus for our European Council. And we've obviously continued ongoing tracking and response to proposed legislation, whether that be related to tenant screening, ban the box, fair chance, or access legislation. One of our most significant activities has been the ongoing litigation in the state of Arkansas in the US. In 2018, Arkansas's Bentonville County Court closed off access to public records to our members, leaving employers and background screeners without a path to check public record data in Bentonville County. After a loss at the circuit court, the Arkansas court clerk represented by the Arkansas Attorney General's office sued Arkansas, appealing the decision to the Arkansas Supreme Court. Last week, the Arkansas Supreme Court issued their filing affirming that PBSA members, and therefore all of you as employers, have a right to access public records from the court. This was an important precedent-setting win for PBSA and background screening and access in general. These court records, by their very name, are public records, and we can now resume access to ensure thorough background checks can continue. Most importantly, if this same case comes up in any other jurisdictions across the US, we also have experience and understanding of how to proceed in presenting our position and why this is so important for members. On the global front, we've continued to proceed with the Global General Accreditation Program. This program is designed to cover employee screening, background screening outside of the US, and will fall under our BSCC for administration. And PBSA volunteers and partners have continued to work for our members and advocate for positive changes and progress. We could not have predicted or planned for this year, but we're really proud of how our members and how our association has responded. We've continued to support customers, employers, and partners, and understand how we've been able to remain strong as an association. We know for many of you, it's been a difficult year, and we want to thank you for your time and your own dedication and persistence this year. If no one said thank you to you, we're here to say thank you. Our association has been better for the efforts this year, and we understand the challenges and struggles that we're able to meet. So that's enough from us. We know you've got questions, so we're going to turn the next several minutes over to you. If you haven't already, please submit your questions in the chat feature. Our moderator has been gathering those and sending them over to us. And I'm going to go ahead and start posing some of these questions to Melissa. But again, if we don't get to your question or you have additional information, feel free to reach out to Melissa and I directly as well. Okay, Melissa, are you ready?
I'm ready.
The questions are here.
Okay.
So with the possible second, third, or continued first wave, depending on your jurisdiction, first wave of the pandemic, do you have expectations for additional shutdowns, or do you think courts are going to close again?
That's a great question. 2020 has taught me to not have expectations. What we have learned, though, is we can get through a number of things that we didn't even anticipate coming. So while we see waves of this, whether depending on who you talk to, it's classified as a second wave or just a continuation of a huge first wave, and numbers in many areas continuing to get worse, prompting local legislatures and leaders to shut down or enforce additional restrictions, maybe reimposing lockdowns. I think we should be prepared. We as an association and our members are prepared now that we've gone through this once, should additional shutdowns occur. We have learned a number of things as an association, our members, on how to adapt and how to transition relatively quickly. And I'll also say, a number of the information sources used that downtime, that lockdown time, to also figure out alternatives, like perhaps enabling remote access where they didn't exist before, or our work to ensure our members are considered essential workers so they can continue to access the courts and those types of things. So I definitely think it's possible that background checks could again be impacted if significant lockdowns were to roll out around the globe in various areas. But I think we're better equipped, as are the information sources, to mitigate the impact. So no promises that, the rest of 2020 and even perhaps first or second quarter into 2021 are without bumps. I think they're just going to be hopefully a little bit shorter in duration and a little bit more manageable with the expertise we've gained in 2020.
Great. And we've had a couple of different questions on this same sort of topic, but are you seeing employers deciding not to run background checks, or is there something that they can do when there are court closures during the pandemic?
That's a great question. We've heard questions like this from a number of employers, whether it was, should we discontinue background screening knowing that there's shutdowns in our area right now, or just general inquiries about what's the best thing for us to do, anticipating or knowing that shutdowns are coming. Generally, what we've seen and what I've seen from the employers that I work within the organization at large is that most are not discontinuing their screening practices and policies and processes. Most have made the decision that continuing a process that they have set aside or developed for background screening, they put a lot of thought, time, and consideration into who gets background checks, what the components of the background checks should be for that individual or that particular role they're hiring for. So to set that aside completely could potentially put them at risk in the future if they ever had to defend their policy or their background screening program. Most, I think, at this point have determined that regardless of whether there's temporary unavailability of information, the best course of action is to proceed with the background checks, proceed with ordering the components that they would have otherwise ordered should there be no disruption in service, and then look at how they'll handle those on a one-off basis. So whether it's waiting to do some and doing a waiting to bring the individual on until the results are back in, or a number of them have implemented some contingent hire situations. So bringing the individuals onto their organization contingent on the results of that background check when they do become available.
Great. Yeah, and I know we were on a call just this week with many what we call end users, but employers across the US, many of whom have global operations, and that's exactly what they said. Most of them are sticking with their policy and their process and making accommodations where they need. So it does look like we're actually at the end of our time here. If we didn't get to your question, please, by all means, reach out to Melissa or I directly. We'd be happy to set up a time to talk, and we can certainly post some of these questions on the various portals we have within PBSA if you have the option to access that. Thank you very much for everyone attending or viewing this presentation later. We wish you a great conference. Enjoy the rest of your time, and thank you as well to Neeyamo for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.